My name is Gisele Bourgeois. I'm doing on remediation applied to practicing physicians, and my supervisors are Tim Tunison and Glenn McGeer. I live in Victoria, British Columbia, which is in Vancouver Island. That's a picture actually of Victoria. And contrary to all the pictures of Canada that you see covered with ice and snow, it hardly ever snows here. In fact, we haven't had any snow for the last 2 years. So as you can no doubt tell, I'm a little bit older than the average, actually a fair bit older than the average PhD student. I'm an OBGYN by background. I transitioned to administration when my children were teenagers, and I wanted to be home more. I served for 10 years as the director of a program to assess and remediate practicing physicians in trouble. So this is at a university, and we were referred physicians from the regulatory authority. So everything from physicians who had questions of clinical competence, to poor communication skills, to boundary issues and having sex with patients. And while there was undoubtedly the occasional sociopath, most of the physicians we dealt with were actually not bad people. And indeed, if you talk with people who work in this field, those physicians in most cases are not that much different from the rest of us. They've just, in various cases, run into problems, not always for reasons of their own control. So in that position, I found that assessing these physicians was actually a lot easier than trying to arrange remediation. So I left Manitoba in 2008 and was unable to continue that work in my new position at UBC. But the issue remained one that I was passionate about, and so a little while ago I decided to, quote, semi-retire. I now only work a couple of days a week, and so I could pursue a PhD. So the literature on physician remediation is actually quite sparse. A lot of it comes from Canada, actually. And most of the information is in the grey literature. For example, if you try, you can find quite a lot of information and documents from the UK. One of the problems is that there's no agreement on what the term includes. So, for example, if someone was practicing successfully for several years and took time off either to look after elderly relatives or to take an administrative post and wanted to go back into practice, some programs consider that remediation and some don't. Some include doctors who have had to take time off for physical and mental illness, and others don't. So this leads to the fact that the reported range of practicing physicians requiring remediation varies from 1.9% to 12% and up. In fact, the regulatory authority here in BC was telling me last year that of the physicians that they assess, mostly randomly, about 30% could do use of remediation. And I don't think it's because the physicians in BC are particularly incompetent, but basically in further discussion, he felt that about 30% of physicians could use some improvement in practice. And I would guess that's a low figure. We could all use some improvement in practice. The fact that we don't actually have a good definition also causes a variability in reporting success rates. Most programs suggest about 2/3, less in older physicians, but there are no long-term studies. So, for example, we don't know what happens more than 2 years out. Anecdotally, and certainly from my own experience, some people are, quote, frequent flyers who do well enough to pass the remediation, but they come back. So there are many factors to be considered in physician remediation, socio-political, educational, cultural. So fortunately for me, this appears to be a good time to study remediation, as there's increasing demands for physician accountability across the globe. Some issues around remediation are more country-specific. For example, who pays for remediation can be different in countries where physicians are employees of the state versus self-employed, and some are more generalizable. From what I've read, I gather there are some parallels between the Canadian and the Dutch systems. For example, I've read that you have a mandatory peer-led scheme for specialist re-registration, including mandatory CME and peer-led visits. We do have mandatory CME in Canada. Our peer-led visits vary from one province to another. We have 10 provinces, each with their own system. We do have the Physician Performance Improvement Initiative in Canada that will be rolling out in a few months, and the focus will be on using data for physicians to help improve their performance. So in that framework, remediation is mentioned as the responsibility of the universities. But the universities are balking for a variety of reasons. It's one of those things where everybody agrees it should be done, but no one wants to do it. So for example, when I moved from Manitoba to British Columbia in 2008, I wanted to do some of the stuff at the university. I was told, no, we don't want to do that because then we'll be seen as an arm of the regulatory authority, and our regular CPD customers won't want to come back to our courses. So there are also educational issues around remediation that I think may be different for practicing physicians than in residency. or maybe not. It's something we don't really know. So in several cases that I've seen, for example, people know what they should be doing. They're competent, they just don't perform for a variety of reasons. They think it takes too much time to document it properly. They don't think they should follow a particular guideline. So they see that it needs to be done, but they need to improve how they run their practice. There's also the issue of remediation in older learners, everything from cognitive issues to motivation. And as we know, our competence is a team sport, so we need to look beyond the individual. There are also many sociocultural issues which appear to transcend geographic and cultural differences. The study of the culture of shame and blame, for example, and there's a recent study from Colorado that showed that physicians tend to distance themselves from struggling colleagues. There's also a culture of reluctance to challenge a colleague's practice, and a culture of covering up and protecting incompetent colleagues. And if you want to read a horror story, you should read the book Blind Eye. It's about a psychopathic killer who became a doctor so that he could poison people, and how he managed to do so across several states and several countries, because he was always given the benefit of the doubt as a physician. Another issue in medical culture is that medicine is a self-regulating profession, and that too is changing. And it's very fascinating to read the sociology of medicine literature and see how others see us. So, for example, sociologists have what they call a stratification theory. The fact that as the medical profession is losing some of its autonomy across the world, medicine is becoming stratified. So you have the rank and file practitioners who are losing autonomy, but the hierarchy, the people at the top, the people in regulatory authorities and academia, who are pushing guidelines and enforcing those guidelines, and working with governments to do that, they're having a bit more control. So the rank and file is losing some autonomy, but the profession as a whole is managing to keep it. So when I first talked to my supervisors about studying remediation, because of my past experience, I was more interested in what works. I wanted to be practical and solve this problem. But they led me to understand that my role as a PhD student wasn't to solve the problem, because the problem can look differently in different times and places. And even if my efforts were successful, it would only be temporary and for one location, if I was lucky even to get that. So instead, they said that my role was to help people think about the problem differently, and then people could use that new insight to grapple with the problem as it manifested itself locally. So in thinking about that, it became obvious that we actually don't know how people conceptualize remediation, and that's part of the problem. So that's what the thesis is going to focus on. What is remediation when applied to practicing physicians? So the first study, and since Glenn Revere is my co-supervisor, of course, I will have to start with the concepts paper. So the first study is a literature review, looking not only at the sparse literature on remediation, but also on other literatures that might have a bearing, such as the literature on competence, on learning theories, on professional governance, and on the sociology of medicine. And the outcome of that will be a concept paper on the meaning of remediation of practicing physicians as presented in the literature, and proposed alternative conceptualizations, either because our current conceptualizations are problematic or because important aspects are missing. I'm currently in the process of writing that paper in the early draft. So the second study is a grounded theory study, which we started. We're conducting semi-structured interviews across the country with different stakeholders, including regulatory authorities, certifying colleges, health authorities, university, postgrad, and continuing education officers, our medical protective association, etc. And we want to know how people are thinking about remediation, and more importantly, are they all talking about the same thing? So as I mentioned, I've done about 5 interviews so far, trying to do one from each of the different stakeholder groups, and find it quite interesting to see what people are thinking about remediation. The next study will be looking at what remediation preceptors do. We want to understand how remediation is conducted in the trenches, if you will. And we're going to conduct focus groups of remediation preceptors to see how they conceptualize what they do. Many of them also teach in immediate residence, and so we want to know, what are they doing differently, what are the challenges, and how to review the physicians that they remediate. And by the time we get to the fourth study, I suspect that the plan may evolve a little. The fourth study was initially conceived as a grounded theory study, how physicians who undergone remediation conceptualize remediation, and how the conceptions affect not only their experience, but also the impact on their self-concept as a person, as a physician, and as a member of the medical community. So the recent Canadian Conference on Medical Education was a group from McMaster that presented a study of residents undergoing remediation, showing that the process actually made it harder for the residents to learn. And it would be interesting to know whether that's also the case for practicing physicians. And it'd also be interesting to know how the experience affected them both at the time and subsequently. So the feeling that the fourth study may end up a little bit different than slightly initially conceived, and may end up more as a phenomenological study. And finally, the last study will be using data from the previous 3 studies to analyze verbatim stakeholder comments using critical discourse analysis to explore what they reveal both directly and indirectly about how the various stakeholders think about remediation and about the physicians who have to undergo it. We're also going to look at the language used in available program documents and try to understand why is remediation of practicing physicians so difficult to address. I mentioned that I used to work in the field and haven't since 2008, and I recently went back to a meeting of a group that I used to belong to, and remediation continues to be quite difficult to address. So it's been said that to undertake a Foucauldian discourse analysis is to study how particular discourses construct systematically different versions of the social world. And I think of this as a particularly apt method for an exploration of why the medical profession struggles with the problem of remediation. Different stakeholders have different versions of what the problem is, of what remediation is and what it should be, which also, I guess, relates to another advantage of critical discourse analysis, in that it can also be a politically informed analysis. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of political factors surrounding this topic, at least in Canada, and I suspect around the world also. And I understand that medical education has only fairly recently discovered Foucault. The rest of the world has moved on to Bourdieu. So again, this study may also evolve slightly, but it will definitely be a critical discourse analysis. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions.